What is a family secret you have learned when you were already an adult? That my grandmother was adopted, sort of. My great-grandmother miscarried her child. At the time, 1930s-40s, I think, all women were put in the same ward in the hospital after they gave birth, even if the baby didn't survive. Anyway, there was a woman in the bed next to my great-grandmother who had just given birth, but she didn't want a child. She wanted the hospital staff to get rid of it. So they just gave the baby to my great-grandmother. No paperwork or anything. They had one woman who was distraught having lost her baby, and another distraught having got her baby, and I guess just thought I know how to fix this. Seems so weird by today's standards, and definitely illegal, but I guess it was perfectly logical. As far as I know, they all lived happily ever after. Discovered a few years back that my maternal grandfather died in prison in California during the late 40s after being jailed for sexually molesting a minor. We were always told he died in a car accident. My mother was just 12 or 13 at the time. Everyone who ever knew anything about it is now deceased, so we'll never know any details. But we now assume our mother was a malignant narcissist because she herself was likely abused. She was a crappy wife and mother, but she somehow broke the cycle of abuse, at least the sexual part. My grandfather was married for a few months before he met Grandma. No one knew until Grandma's funeral, and we were all sitting around at the funeral home talking the director and lawyers. My aunt flipped out from 0 to 60 with the "Do we have any brothers or sisters we don't know about?" to her newly widowed father. Did Mom know? Yes, Grandma knew. They'd only been married a few months. I assume she saw her future in an instant and got the hell out of Dodge. The future my grandmother got. My paternal grandfather served in Vietnam and suffered from such extreme PTSD that when he returned from war he locked himself in the barn for 4 days straight. When he finally emerged, he tried convincing my grandmother that the world was ending and that he needed to save his family by killing her and their 4 children. She took my father and all of his siblings to her mother's house. When she went back to check on my grandfather a week later, he had fucked all of the farm animals, slaughtered them, and then shot himself in the face. My mother and aunt are adopted. I don't know the full story. But apparently my mother and aunt's bio mother attempted to kill the both of them when they were kids, tried to blow up the house with a stove, or something of that nature. I've never met my mom's birth parents. It kind of makes sense now. The genes in my family are very strong, all of us look very similar, but my mom's parents look very different from us. My older brother told me this when I was 21. He found out from our grandfather who apparently let it slip in front of him. I'm not sure why we were never told this. None of me or my siblings would ever think differently about our grandparents. We love them so much. But at the end of the day I do believe it is their business alone, and they can tell me when if they're ready to. Apparently my aunt and mom's bio mother has been in a mental hospital ever since. My grandparents took in my mom and aunt after the situation. All I know is when I learned this, I loved my grandparents even more. It just reinforced in me that my grandparents are genuinely kind and giving people. Rip to my grandfather. I'm gonna call my grandma now. My grandma's brother was gay and killed by his ex-lover. I just knew he was a handsome and super talented guy. A famous female poet was in love with him, and everything about him was genius. Then some man killed him randomly, but it was his ex-lover who stabbed him. So today that's of course not a big deal, but he comes from a very religious family, so it even took my grandma, who adored him, a while to learn the truth. My grandparents on my mother's side were swingers, all 4 of them. After my mother was born her mother and father split up, and then each married a person from another couple, sort of a marriage merge. My great aunt had a kid that absolutely nobody in the family knew about. She moved to the West Coast for work when she found out, and stayed long enough to have the baby, recover, and give him up for adoption. Apparently she never even knew who the father was, and it was the 50s, so that was kinda frowned upon. She also stayed in touch through his whole life, and visited as often as she could. A couple years ago she finally told everybody, and he's been a beloved member of the family ever since. My very pious grandmother, on her deathbed, revealed she had another child. She had him while still in high school, and gave him up for adoption. Funny thing is that my mother and her siblings all knew him already, they just didn't know he was related. He's a few years older than my mother, and they apparently always joked around about looking similar. My great-uncle murdered my great-aunt by pushing her down the stairs. Another great-aunt was forced to go into an asylum for no reason other than woman problems. My one second cousin had a secret child that no one knew about until my mom found him on a DNA site. Someone on my dad's side was killed in an asylum by another patient with a chair. My one second cousin was sexually abused all her life by her stepfather. We recently found out that her mother knew about it, but only blamed my cousin for being too seductive. She was 10 when it started. Edit. Also, a distant family member who was a Mason was found murdered in a lake back in the early 1900s. My aunt and grandma actually kidnapped me when I was 4. I have a very faint memory of staying with them. But I spent about a year with them before my parents got me back. I wasn't really abused, but to hide who I was they shaved my head and told everyone I was a boy. Also, instead of saying I was 4 they said I was 2. The faint memory was being mad my hair was gone. And being really upset I had to wear pull-ups. I didn't know until a picture of me I had never seen before resurfaced. Asked my mom about it, and she finally told me. Late one summer night, when I was in my mid-20s, my mom had had a little too much to drink. She and I were sitting alone in her screened-in porch, and out of the blue she said, "I liked your father, but I never loved him. I was in love with a boy from home, David. David went off to serve in World War II and was killed. Your father served with him and came to visit after the war. He said he's promised David to look after me and offered to marry me in David's place. I've always wondered what life would have been like if David hadn't died." She drifted off to sleep and I left. Dad was gone by then, and what could I have asked him, even if he had been alive? Since my brother and sisters felt Mom and Dad's marriage was the gold standard, I've always assumed I was the only one who knew. My uncle was a contract killer and killed many people for organized crime. He killed his first person at 16 years old. Was never caught for murders, but went to prison for other things. Stated the first few years you get raped, after that you do the raping. He later completely turned his life around, became a single father after the mother died. Then a few years ago killed himself. From what I understand my grandfather was very mean to him, and he had a very troubled childhood. In Mexico, my grandparents owned a tortilla factory. They had money and lived in a small town. They also had 18 children. It wasn't until I got drunk with my cousin, when I found out that his dad, my uncle, told him that 7 of my uncle's siblings are not biologically related to them at all. What happened was my grandparents took and surrendered babies from random people in the town that knew them because they could not take care of them themselves. My grandpa was also an ex-cop, so cops themselves would ask them if they wanted another abandoned kid. So here I am, drunk, realizing that my cousins aren't really my cousins, and I know that blood does not make you family, but it still hits considering we are a close big family. It's just a feeling though, it changes nothing. My mom was cheating on my dad for years with a guy she and I both work with. My dad forgave her, and they're still together. My parents would regularly go out together with the guy she cheated with, and my dad would even hang out with him one-on-one after he found out about the affair. My mom and I still work with him. They don't all hang out anymore, it's just such a weird dynamic. I think my dad had the keep your enemies close mentality at first, but then really became friends with the guy. Even though my dad has forgiven my mom, he still brings it up all of the time and gets really paranoid on nights they work together, especially if I'm not working that night. It's like he thinks, if I'm not there something will happen. The affair happened at least 10 years ago, and I've worked with the guy for 6 years now. I just found out about 6 months ago. I always had suspicious and had overheard things from family over the years, but my mom finally came out and told me the truth. Just so weird seeing them all hang out as friends knowing what happened and working with him all of the time. I've told me mom it's super unhealthy that she's still so close with him, and it just seems to cause unnecessary problems, but it's not my relationship.